Hello and welcome to our next webinar in the How-To series. My name is Amber Letcher and I'm one of the co-directors for Strengthening the Heartland. We have a great presentation for you this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to give you a few instructions. First of all, if you'd like to follow along with the presentation, you can find the handouts in the handout section of your dashboard. We also ask that you take a brief survey for us at the end of the presentation. It's helpful to get your feedback, as well as if you have ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see, you can certainly share those there. So you'll see the link to the survey in the chat box. And if you're watching this through a recording, you'll be able to find that survey link wherever you're accessing this recording as well. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our presenter today, Ms. Kanbi Knippling. She is currently a doctoral student at the University of Montana. Welcome, Kanbi. We're really happy to have you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am so excited to be here, and I'm been really thankful for these kinds of platforms in the past year that allow us to continue having these conversations just virtually. And so just a little bit about me, like Dr. Ledger said, I am a current doctoral student at the University of Montana in counselor education and supervision. I have bachelor's degrees in psychology and human development family studies, as well as a master's in clinical mental health counseling, where I also did additional coursework in play therapy. And part of the reason why I am so excited about and passionate about this topic is I have firsthand lived experience of what it's like to be a youth with a disability in youth programming. And so a little bit about that experience that I have is you can see on this slide, there's a bunch of different pictures that kind of depict all of the different things that I was involved in growing up. So I was involved in everything from 4-H to drama club to choir, band, summer camps, all of these different things that were not always my parents' favorite things because they had to get me to those places and scheduling and all of those different things. But because of my disability, I was born with a condition called myelomeningocele spina bifida, which is just as much of a tongue twister as it sounds, and it's just as fun to learn how to spell when you're 7 years old. There was that accessibility component was a part of everything that I did. And so every activity, every programming that I was involved in, there was some sort of component of, okay, how are we going to make this work? And so that kind of started my interest in this topic. And now I've kind of broadened it to try to be as inclusive as possible with all sorts of different considerations, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So it kind of led me to today and to this conversation. So that's kind of the fast facts version of who I am and what brings me here today. But I would love to get a chance to get a little bit more information about you all and what brings you here today. So if you feel comfortable doing so, I would love if you can include a little bit about yourself in the chat. So including a little bit about what brings you here today, what are the takeaways that you would like to get out of this conversation, and then a little bit of information about where you're located. So just general area, state, however you feel comfortable doing that. And like I have said a couple of times, I really want this to be a conversation as we go through today. I really want this to be, as conversational and, as allow you to give feedback and ask questions and those types of things. So going forward, there's going to be another opportunity where I'm going to ask for specific information that you put into the chat. But I would love throughout the time, our time here together, if you have questions or comments or things that you want to expand on when we have our question section at the end, feel free to do that at any time. And I would love to kind of continue that conversation in that sense. So I'm just going to be quiet here for a second and let you do that.
Yes, so you can type in your responses into the chat feature. You won't be able to see them as an attendee, but I'll read through some of them as they come along, just so we can see who is on the call with us. So it looks like we've got a 4-H professional from Pennsylvania. Welcome, so happy to have you. Another 4-H extension educator from PA. Lots of representation from Pennsylvania. Hello. Let's see, extension from Illinois, a middle school counselor, more extension from Kansas, a parent educator from North Dakota. Welcome. Oh, we're getting some more here. A community health worker from right here in South Dakota. Welcome. Independent living choices, more community specialists, quite a few extension educators, more from Minnesota. A great group, lots of extension educators with us this morning. So we'll let you.
That makes me very, very excited to just learn a little bit more about who's in the room, and especially the extension 4-H. I have a big background in that, so that makes me excited as well. So again, like Dr. Letcher said, welcome. I appreciate you all being here, and I, again, welcome any questions, comments that you have from your areas of expertise, things that you would like me to expand on as we move forward. So when we're having these conversations, one of the foundational things that is important to kind of know going into those conversations is answering the question, what do we already know? What do we know about youth with disabilities and their experiences in youth programming? So just kind of a few little fast facts to be aware of is that nearly 1 out of every 5 children in the US has a special healthcare need. So special healthcare need refers to disabilities, including physical, intellectual, and developmental disabilities, as well as chronic medical conditions like asthma, diabetes, those kinds of things as well. And we also know that over 2 million adolescents in the US have some form of chronic illness. So the chances that the youth programming and events that we do, including some a participant that has a disability or a chronic illness, is pretty likely that at some point we're going to have participants that have special health care needs that we should be mindful of. We also know that successful inclusion can foster a sense of community and connection for youth with disabilities in programming. And that is, in general, true for all youth in general, that it can create those connections and that sense of community. That's especially true for youth with disabilities because growing up with any sort of difference in terms of like disability, chronic illness, whatever it may be, can oftentimes feel kind of isolating and very lonely, and feeling like nobody really understands what my experience is. I'm kind of this outsider, and so being able to have those opportunities where you can participate with your peers and do the same things and feel like one of the group can be very, very important in those instances. So another foundational thing that we want to be aware of when we're having these conversations is what exactly are we meaning by the terms disability and accessibility? So I warned you that there was going to be another opportunity where I was going to ask for specific feedback in the chat, and that's right now. So I would like to just take a second here and have you put into the chat what comes to mind when you are thinking of the terms disability and accessibility, particularly disability. What are the first things that pop into your head about what those terms mean? I would love to hear a little bit of feedback for what pops into your head in that.
Give people a little bit to type here. Somebody typed in, they think of limitations, something that limits your daily function in some way, limits your daily routine in some way. But disability sounds like it comes from a deficit-based approach. I think of individuals who access things and go about their daily life in a different way. Some people think about accommodations that might be needed that it's not just physical disability, but also learning disabilities and mental health issues.
Mhm.
Let's see, it can be a lifelong diagnosis that someone lives with. Those look like the main ones so far.
I appreciate all of those responses. And I think in particular, there was a response about it's not just physical disability, it's there's learning considerations, there's all of these different things that we may not be able to physically see when interacting with people. We don't always know what their experiences are and what the conditions are that they're living with. And that's a very important point that I was wanting to make here, is that oftentimes when we think about disability, we're thinking of people like me, like people who use wheelchairs and have been wheelchair users for a long time, or use crutches or some sort of mobility aid, people who are blind and use a cane or a service animal, those kinds of things. But again, it's not always things that we can see. We can't always know someone's experience just by looking at them. And so being very mindful that there are invisible conditions. So we'll use the terms visible and invisible disabilities to describe, visible being, again, people like me, where you can see, that I use a wheelchair, those kinds of things, but invisible conditions that people may live with that we can't see. We don't know exactly what accommodations they might need just by looking at them. And so those things are very important to be aware of too. But then also, again, we tend to think of these long-term conditions, and these very, oftentimes they do have a negative connotation to them, but also being mindful that when we're talking about accessibility, short-term conditions that happen to us matter as well. So how many of us have ever broken a bone, like in our leg, or we've broken our arm, we've sprained our ankle, those kinds of things? And those things that when they happen to us, they impact our accessibility as well. And so being mindful of those things as well, that we all have things that can impact us at any time, that can impact how well we can move around and interact with our space, those kinds of things. And so thinking about it in those terms as well can be really important too, because we can all be impacted in some sort of way and have our accessibility concerns change on a daily basis. So that's really what the point of our conversation here today is about, is figuring out, what are some concrete kind of checklist type things that we can consider moving forward to create accessible programming for youth. And I really want to emphasize here that, again, this is just a starting point for this conversation. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all of the different considerations that would be important in kind of creating and designing programming, but it's meant to have a place to expand on and continue this conversation, and to just really kind of just give some tangible pieces that we can start with in that sense. And so I think at the end of this presentation, you will be given my email address or ways of contacting me. And I would be happy to continue this conversation and kind of expand on things in any way that would be helpful as well. And I would love that. So feel free to do that after our time here together today is over with. And again, this is a starting point. It's not necessarily meant to be exhaustive in that sense. So again, just another quick stopping point here to talk about language. Again, that's kind of another one of those foundational things that I think is important to talk about going forward. And I specifically want to mention this because moving forward today, you might hear me use the terms person with a disability or individual with a disability and disabled person or disabled individual interchangeably. And I want to specifically make a note of that because especially when you're working with youth with disabilities, because it's something that is growing particularly with youth and young adults. It's kind of grown over the past several years and decades really, is this change on the difference between person first language and identity first language. And so there's a growing movement within the disability community at large to use identity first language. And that's saying, disabled person or disabled individual rather than person with disability, and kind of really claiming that disability identity and kind of claiming that, this is not something that I'm ashamed about or that I should feel shame or, embarrassed about or things like that. And like, this is really part of my identity. And that is something that is particularly, like I said, really growing within youth and young adults with disabilities. And so being really mindful of that when we are talking about disability can be really important. So when you're interacting with someone who has a disability, and if they refer to themselves as a disabled person or a disabled individual in some way, not correcting them, not saying like, oh, don't refer to yourself that way, or things like that can be really important. Just following their lead on how they prefer to identify themselves. So when I'm having larger, more formal conversations kind of like this, I will generally use the term person with disabilities because that is, there are still individuals who prefer that terminology. And so that's something that I will use more in general. But when referring to myself, I tend to use disabled person or disabled individual. And that's just kind of a preference thing. And so just really following the individual's lead on how they prefer to identify themselves. So the first consideration I really wanted to start with today is how are we, promoting and kind of getting the information out to potential participants about our events or our programming, and then how are we registering those participants for the event or the programming itself? Because we really want to ensure inclusivity from the start. And advertising and registration is really one of those starting points of programming in general. There's other considerations that we might think about before we start thinking about advertising and registration, but as far as what our participants are aware of, like this is really the foundational starting point of how they get to know about the things that we're planning for them. And so kind of just having that consideration, that accessibility mindset from these points can be really important. So things that we want to be aware of when we're creating advertising and registration forms and things like that is forms of advertising. So for example, if we're creating a video, is there an audio component available as part of that video so that individuals who have visual impairments or who are blind can listen to that information even if they can't see the video, making sure that they can get that information from an audio component. Again, for like print materials, color contrast for individuals with visual impairments can be really important. Just making sure that they can see that print material in a way that's accessible. If we're posting on social media like Instagram, Facebook, those kinds of things, are we including image descriptions for individuals who use screen readers so that they can get that information and kind of be able to get that even if they can't necessarily see the image, those kinds of things. And along that line, there are image descriptions included in the notes section of the slides handout that I think that you were given today. But if there's images that I've used today that you would like descriptions for, those kinds of things, please let me know and we can do that live as well. So another thing that we want to include with advertising is accessibility statements, and I'll have examples of what that looks like here in a second. But accessibility statements are really just statements that we can include in our materials that communicate our commitment to making things accessible and to ensuring the inclusion of all of our participants, and then really identifying a contact person that potential participants can reach out to, and to talk about accessibility concerns that they might have and to request accommodations, those kinds of things, really making that information really as concrete as possible. So again, like I said, I created a few examples here, and the first one here is an example of what an accessibility statement might look like on a flyer that you might create. And so the flyer that I've created here that hopefully you can see is for an art club that participants are able to join or to learn more information about. And so we've got the usual information on this flyer about what the programming actually is, for the art club, when and where they can learn more information about it, but then also that accessibility statement. So again, starting with our commitment to providing access, equal opportunity, and reasonable accommodation in our programming, identifying someone for participants to reach out to talk about accommodations and accessibility. I usually would recommend having 2 different forms of contact information for individuals to use. So on this example, I've got a phone number and an email address so that they can kind of choose which form of communication they would prefer. And then also identifying a date that you would like accommodations to be made by. So depending on the size of your event, you might want to do like 3 weeks ahead of time, having that date, like if at all possible, please request accommodations by this time. Smaller events, you might have a week ahead of time, or, depending on the kind of accommodations and how much planning would go into that. But generally, I try to do about that 2 to 3 week ahead of time, just in case we need to have further conversations and really figure out details and things like that. So that's one example of what that might look like. And then in this example is an example of a couple of questions that you might include in a registration form. This example isn't necessarily meant to include all of the information that you might need depending on your event and the information that you would like to have, but it's just kind of an example of what some accessibility focused questions might look like. So in this example, it's an Educating Youth Artists Symposium. So the first question here is asking about lodging needs. So if it's an event that their hotel rooms might be involved, or those kinds of accommodations. So specifically asking about the needs that the participant would have. So the options for that question being no lodging needed, they're not planning on staying overnight, those kinds of things. A standard room, so just a standard hotel room that is kind of anybody can use type of thing. And then the accessible room options. So accessible rooms for wheelchair users or those with mobility impairments. Oftentimes they might need a roll-in shower, an accessible bed. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Tubs, shower chairs, so for those who maybe aren't wheelchair users or use crutches or things, but still have mobility concerns in terms of they might not be able to stand in a shower for long periods of times for a variety of reasons, so it's important to have a shower chair, those kinds of things. Deaf and hard of hearing considerations, again, we'll talk about that here in a second a little bit more. Second question being dietary needs, kind of leaving that space for them to expand on any of those considerations that they might have if you plan on having food at your event. And then having space for other considerations as well that may not be encompassed in the previous questions. So leaving space for participants to expand on any of that information that they might need at the event itself. Mobility considerations, service animal considerations, again, we'll chat about that in a second. And also having other options, for like having an option that says other and allowing participants to expand on that in that way, so that anything that might not be encompassed in previous questions, they have that space to identify in those questions as well. All right, and we've chatted a little bit about this, so I won't go into too much detail here, but again, the dietary restrictions for our consideration number 2, thinking about food and lodging, leaving space for participants to identify any dietary restrictions that they might have, hotel rooms, making sure that if you are blocking hotel rooms or reserving blocks of hotel rooms for your event or your programming, that ADA accessible rooms are included in that block. So considerations that might be important to consider are beds. As a wheelchair user, there have been lots of times in my life where I have stayed in an ADA accessible room, but the bed is generally like about as tall as I am. So even though I'm fairly independent in how I can transfer and all of those different things, I've had to end up sleeping in my wheelchair because I can't get on the bed. So those types of things can be important. Showers, roll-in showers. So roll-in showers are kind of just exactly what they sound like. They make it easier for wheelchair users or those with mobility impairments to just kind of roll in and roll out and kind of situate their wheelchair how they need to. Deaf, hard of hearing considerations. So those hotel rooms generally will have like light systems that indicate if someone's knocking at the door, if the phone's ringing, if there's an emergency, those kinds of things. So that can be really important for anyone who has auditory considerations. Equipment. So again, like I said with the beds, sometimes individuals might need a bed lift or something like that if they are attending the event with a caregiver or someone who can help operate that for them. And so it can be helpful if at all possible to know someone that you can put participants in contact with about where can I potentially get this equipment that I need, those kinds of things, if at all possible, just helping them kind of navigate that and making their stay a little bit easier. And then service animals. So if someone does have a service animal, would they prefer to be on the first floor so that, you know, when their animal has to go outside, it's a little easier for them to do that? Is there specific areas on the property that the hotel would prefer that animal have a toileting area at? Those kinds of things, helping participants kind of navigate those considerations. So consideration number 3 being the accessibility of the event space. There's a lot on here, so please let me know if I need to expand on anything or if I'm going too fast or things like that. But some physical considerations to be aware of with the event space in particular include parking and transportation. So are there parking spaces available at the event space for individuals with accessible vans or accessible vehicles to park at? What kinds of parking is available there? So what I mean by that is, so in my current van, I have a ramp that comes out on my passenger side. So I need quite a large crosshatch or access aisle on my passenger side in order for me to be able to navigate in and out of my van. But in my previous van, I had all of my equipment, like my wheelchair lift and everything, on my driver's side. And so I often had a really hard time finding a place to park or a suitable place for me to park because I needed that large enough space for me to navigate my wheelchair and all of that stuff, but I also needed it on the driver's side. Most of the time, those large access aisles are on the passenger side. And so kind of helping participants figure out, like, where am I going to park and how's that going to work? Terrain, are participants going to be able to get around this event space and things like that? And what are some considerations we might need to think about with that? I'm a South Dakota farm kid, so I kind of grew up in pastures and gravel and those types of things, but my wheelchairs definitely show it. I'm very hard on my wheelchairs in that sense, and so being mindful of those kinds of things, because accessibility equipment, mobility equipment can take quite a beating if the terrain is a little rough. Doorways, making sure that everyone has enough adequate space to get through and out of the doorways. Is there stairs that we need to be mindful of? Are the elevators working? Carpet. I often joke that as a wheelchair user, carpet is the bane of my existence because it just makes it a lot harder. I get a lot more resistance kind of going through different spaces. Bathrooms, making sure that there are accessible bathrooms for individuals to use. Seating, making sure that those who are wheelchair users like me can like move chairs if needed, or those with visual or auditory considerations have space at the front of the room in order to sit and be able to be a part of that conversation and have those considerations part of where they're going to be sitting. And then the size of the space. So if we're going to be having an event in a very large ballroom, and we're going to have different things going on at different, locations in the ballroom. How long is it going to take an individual with disability to get from point A to point B? And are they going to have enough time to be able to do that? Sensory considerations, so lighting, noise, and sense. So, again, thinking of things like epilepsy, like are there going to be a lot of like lighting changes that we need to be aware of? Noise for those with auditory considerations or sensory overload kind of considerations, making sure that's something that we're thinking about. Sense. So I know a lot of people with chronic migraines that, those types of sense can be really triggering for that. So kind of trying to be mindful of that. With as far as like visual, auditory, and communication considerations, technology. So being mindful of the technology that they might need to use, whether it's like screen readers or communication devices or powered wheelchairs, those kinds of things. And then as part of that, plugins, having spaces for them to recharge those devices as needed. A lot of times, we're going to come to the events with things fully charged, but things happen, batteries die. And so making sure that we have that identified where, yeah, you can go plug in your wheelchair over here or kind of charge your device over here or something like that. Ensuring that videos, if at all possible, have captioning services available for those, again, who might have trouble hearing. Front row seating, again, for a wide variety of disabilities, but specifically like visual and auditory disabilities who might have a harder time hearing or seeing from farther back. Acoustics. So, right, kids are loud. Like that's just part of being a kid. But for some people, it might be really hard to focus. When there's a lot of noise going on, might be just impossible for them to hear or to kind of really be a part of the conversation if there's a lot of noise going on. So, how are the acoustics of the space that we're going to be in kind of going to impact that? Again, as much as that's in our control. Interpreters, knowing that someone who is deaf might, or again, a wide variety of disabilities might have an interpreter with them, knowing that speaking to the person themselves and not necessarily the interpreter, like making sure that the person feels included in that conversation, and knowing that that interpreter is just there to help facilitate that. And then large print, braille, those kinds of things, that might be a consideration, again, for like visual and auditory considerations as well. We might need to have handouts and different things in different forms. And so being mindful of those kinds of things. And then service animal considerations. So when an individual has a service animal with them, that animal is going to need space to lie down or something like that during the event. And so making sure that's a possibility. And then again, identifying areas for toileting and water breaks for that animal. And just, not necessarily having to have all of these answers off the top of your head, but just being able to be willing to help facilitate these kind of barriers and things like that as they come up. So our fourth consideration being activities. Can everyone do this activity safely? So a lot of times like youth programming, we have a lot of activities that we like to do to keep kids entertained and do all of those things. And I specifically mentioned the word safely in this question because just thinking back to when I was growing up, and I was a little bit of a daredevil. I was stubborn and I wanted to be included in as much as I possibly could. You saw at the beginning, I was involved in pretty much everything that I could be. And I would oftentimes, if, there wasn't necessarily an accessible way for me to do an activity, I was going to figure out a way to do it anyway. And 20 years later, my shoulders and my joints really do not like me for that because kind of took a beating growing up and kind of doing those types of things. And so just making sure that we're having conversations about that. So ways that we can kind of combat that barrier or kind of facilitate that is to encourage involvement and encourage others to be inclusive as well, having a conversation of what that might look like, then also having a conversation with parents and with caregivers, those kinds of things about what does boundaries look like here? What are the things that we need to be mindful about with safety and those kinds of things? Because I know that, I can think of a particular summer that I went to summer camp. I had a major surgery right beforehand, and I was not allowed to swim or do horseback riding or those kinds of things. And if those weren't a specific part of the conversation, I wouldn't have told anybody. I would have been like, yep, I can do that. That's fine. That's fine. It's totally okay. Because again, I wanted to be included. And so being able to have those conversations about like, no, safety wise, we have to be considerate of this. And then figuring out other ways that I could still be involved in those activities. I just wasn't putting my safety at risk. And then our fifth consideration being financial inclusivity. Sometimes finances are not in our control. Finances are a big part of programming and finding funding and all of those different things, but it can be a huge barrier for people with disabilities. So growing up, my parents and like both my mom and my dad would have to oftentimes take considerable time off of work in order to take me places and like do the FCCLA speech competitions that I was involved in or state 4-H competitions that I was involved in, those kinds of things. They would have to take time off because there wasn't really accessible transportation for me in order to get to and from there. And then I also had some medical considerations where I needed help and there wasn't, someone else who could kind of fill in with that. And so that was kind of a hit to the pocketbook in that sense. And then often accessibility can often mean higher costs, like accessible hotel rooms often cost more than a standard hotel room. Accessible vans definitely cost a lot more. And those kinds of things. And so being really mindful of that, like a lot of times parents, they really want their children to be included, and sometimes finances may not allow for that as much. And so trying to help navigate that barrier. So kind of, again, expanding on that last point of like all of the barriers that can exist, in a perfect world, those are all, those are 5 considerations that we would be able to be mindful of in creating program across the board. But there's barriers to things that, make that hard for us. So the first barrier oftentimes is just resources. Learning about and gathering and implementing resources can oftentimes be very, very overwhelming. There's a lot of information out there, and trying to learn everything about everything is really overwhelming. I mean, even for me, learning about different accessibility considerations that exist beyond my own, I really have to be intentional about that. And so just kind of identifying that and being mindful of that. But then ways that we can address that is to consult with universities and local organizations. So I know that we have some attendees here today that are from across the board in different states, which is amazing. I can speak specifically to like NDSU and SDSU, so North Dakota State and South Dakota State, where they have ADA coordinators as part of their university employees and faculty who can kind of serve as someone to consult with on like, okay, where do I find this resource, those kinds of things. So reaching out to those individuals can be really helpful. And then involving people with disabilities themselves in the planning process. It's oftentimes just best to go straight to the source and say like, what considerations would you want me to consider in designing this event or planning this event? And so kind of just going straight to the source can be really helpful as well. Barrier number 2, with lodging and other accommodations, it may not be possible to fill every accessibility need, especially I'm, again, a small town farm kid, and there often wasn't a lot, in that area where we could kind of figure out all of the different accommodations that would make my life easier. And so had to get a little creative with those kinds of things. So when we're addressing that barrier, it's important to make accommodations a priority early on in event planning. So if there's going to be those barriers that pop up, that we're aware of it early on and we can have those conversations. And then having conversations with attendees of our events and our programming as soon as possible if certain needs are not able to be accommodated, like in hotel rooms or different things like that. So we can kind of do some problem solving and figure out if there's ways that we can kind of still make that work. Barrier number 3, concerns about accommodations being unfair. So some might have the perception that accommodations are unfair advantages that take away resources from others. And again, I have personal experience of that. Like there's a lot of times growing up, I can think of like PE trips or something like that that we would take, and my peers would be like, "Oh, you're so lucky that you don't have to do this," or like the national testing, that physical testing that we would have to do, like, "Oh, you don't have to go run the mile, like, aren't you so lucky?" Like those kinds of things. And that's really hard because as youth, like we want to be involved. Like that's a big part of being uh, a youth or a child, a teenager is wanting to feel included as part of the group. And that can be particularly hard for those with invisible disabilities, the ones where, like for me, it's a little bit more obvious that I need physical accommodations, but for those who have, quote, invisible disabilities, it may not be as obvious. And so then, like, the reason that we're getting accommodations might not be as obvious, and it might cause even more of these kind of ways of thinking of like, oh, you don't look like you have anything wrong with you, and I use wrong in quotations there. So it's, why like it's just an unfair advantage for you to get this accommodation. And so being really mindful of those things. So ways that we can address that is having conversations about accommodations and accessibility and what those actually mean and how those can be really helpful. And then this kind of larger conversation on equality versus equity. So kind of this picture here is kind of describing equality as being like we're all given the same thing across the board, and still that doesn't really work. The little the shorter person in this picture still can't see over the fence, and the middle person can kind of, but not as well as the first person, but they were all given the same box. And then equity on the right here is the first person, the tallest person, didn't need a box because they could see the game, just as well without it. The middle person was given one box, and they could see the same then as the first person, and then the other person was given two, just to make things equitable across the board. And so kind of having that conversation that sometimes we need extra things sometimes in order to make things equitable. The fourth barrier being biases in self and society. So we all have biases. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a physical disability, and so that's where my mind goes a lot of times when we're talking about accessibility and accommodation, and what that means is I think of the physical piece first, and I have to be very intentional about seeking out information and getting experiences and learning from people with other types of disabilities, so I can be very intentional in the things that I'm planning and the things that I'm doing to make sure that they're included. And so asking questions, again, going straight to the source and asking people, what are things that you want me to be mindful of? Educating yourself about media that highlights the experiences of youth with disabilities. There's a handout that I think you will have access to, where I've listed a few examples of shows and books and those kinds of things that highlight those experiences within media, and allow youth to kind of see themselves represented. And then, of course, the fifth barrier is finances. Things cost money. That's the way of the world. And so that's, again, a big part of programming. It's a big part of people with disabilities, their lives in general. And so, that can be a really big barrier. And so ways that we can address that is to reach out to local resources for guidance. So again, reaching out to those university resources, those kinds of things, organizations that exist in your communities, and just trying to find out information. It's like, is there a way that we can get around this? Is there a way that we can kind of address this financial piece? So that was, again, a starting point for this conversation that I really hope that you had some takeaways from. And I, kind of identifying the takeaways that I hope that you kind of get out of this conversation is that this is a process, and we can all continually improve. These are things that it's hard to know everything right at the start, and we're going to miss things sometimes, and that's going to be okay. It's kind of just this idea of once we know better, we do better, and kind of just continually trying to improve in that path. There is some references and resources as part of the handouts that I created. So my references for some of the specific citations that I used in this presentation are included there. And then there's some additional resources that hopefully you can be able to utilize and find useful in that sense. And then I also just want to really make sure that I communicate how thankful I am that you all are here today. Growing up, a lot of it was, figuring out and kind of throwing things at the wall and hoping that they stick, and just kind of trying to figure out how I can be involved in all of these different things from my own personal experience. And as I've grown up and kind of gotten more into the educational kind of academic side of all of these things, I've really gotten to witness a large growth in the amount of conversations that exist around this conversation. People are wanting to know, how can we be more inclusive? How can we make things more accessible? And that means a lot to me on a personal level, that 20 years after I was a youth and growing up in these programs, that we're still working towards making things more inclusive and making things accessible. So thank you so much for being part of that conversation. All right, questions? Is there anything?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, please feel free to type in any questions you have into that chat box, and I can relay those to Kanbi. As we wait for people to type in here, one of the things, Kanbi, I know we've talked about before is, especially with youth programming, we often make a lot of maybe rigid rules to make sure that everything's fair, and there's deadlines that you have to reach, and we're trying to teach youth responsibility, but sometimes that doesn't get the flexibility doesn't get translated as well. So do you recommend putting more of those accessibility statements in things like instructions or registrations? Are there other recommendations you have for making sure people know that, if you need an accommodation, that's definitely an option, but there's also rules in place for other reasons?
Yes, that's definitely something that I would highly recommend, and I think it's very important. And a lot of times it's in an academic kind of context, but I have a lot of conversations with individuals who feel a lot of pressure, like with attendance policies or things like that, where a lot of times people with disabilities, students, all of those different things, like we rely on accessible transportation to get from point A to point B. I rely on that in the winter because it takes a while for me to get into my van and things like that. And so, when you have those kind of strict kind of across the board, no exceptions kind of rules, it can be a lot of pressure of like, oh my gosh, I have to get there. Like, what if something happens? Or what if I get sick? What if I get a chronic illness flare up? Those kinds of things can be a lot of pressure of like, and then that can lead to more stress, which could lead to a flare up, those kinds of things. It just can be a vicious cycle. And so knowing that flexibility can be really, really important, not necessarily in a way of like, oh, we're going to let people get off the hook, but it's just about being understanding and having those statements and as much material as we can, so that people know that they're being included, like they're being, we're thinking about them in the creation of this, and that can be more powerful than anything. Just having that representation and that mindset that like, oh, I'm being included in this.
Really great question came in here. So can you explain one youth development situation, activity, or memory where you felt an educator really saw your disability, made you feel included? They really like hearing personal stories. When have you had a successful experience and really felt included?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes up to my mind is kind of growing up and participating in like field days in school. And we would have these events. A lot of times like soccer was part of the events that we would do. And as a wheelchair user, I mean, I can't necessarily like kick a ball or things like that. I had a teacher who kind of made the rule that like my wheelchair is an extension of me, and so you can't kick the wheelchair. And so my classmates and I figured out, we got really kind of tricky and clever, that we figured out you could kick the soccer ball underneath my wheelchair, and I could just like, because I have a little like area underneath my wheelchair where you can just kind of prop the ball up, and I can just carry it over to the net, and kind of get a little clever about how we get through that, because they couldn't kick my wheelchair, so they couldn't kick it out underneath it. And so it was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of laughs about that. And I still have friends that we kind of remember that time that we got really, really clever about that. So that's kind of the first example that comes to my mind, and there's probably a lot others that I could kind of think of.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, we've got a few more coming in here. Let's see. Oh, somebody is commenting that they have they've done a video series that talks about person first language, and they hadn't heard about this idea of identity first language until today. Would you recommend that the video be updated before it's finalized, or is it still okay to use that person first language? And they just appreciate your insight if you have an opinion.
Like I said, a lot of times, when I'm having more formal conversations, or like just in general conversations when I'm referring to the disability community, I will still use persons with disability, because there are still lots of individuals who prefer that language. But when I'm having conversations about like this language piece, about like person first versus identity first, I will often like include like a little note or a caveat, or something like that, where just stating that this is kind of like the general way that we would refer to the disability community. This is a widely accepted way of referring to the community and talking about individuals with disabilities, but there are people who prefer identity first language. And so making sure that people are aware of that again, it's kind of just going back to following the lead of the person that you're talking to on an individual basis, because there is so much variability in disability, and there's going to be a lot of variability in how we prefer to refer to ourselves. So hopefully that's helpful. If there's larger conversations that anybody would like to have about that, you're welcome to reach out to me, and I would love to do that.
Okay, I'm not seeing any specific questions, others in the chat box. But of course, if people have others, or they'd like to talk to Kanbi a little bit more in detail, she's more than willing to do that. Such a great resource, so we really appreciate your time, Kanbi. And again, thank you to all of you who came today and wanted to learn a little bit more about this topic. You will receive the recording of this session, and then also Kanbi's contact information, as well as the handouts. So look for that in your email. And please, if you have a moment, take that survey, give us a little bit of feedback, and we'd love to know what you want to hear more about next time. So with that, I think we'll end for today. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you all so much.